And so, welcome. In this session, we're going to be discussing modern slavery. And we put together some questions for you to consider throughout this presentation. So please use your phones and scan the QR code, and we'll be taking anonymous responses for this. So when you hear the term slavery, you might think about the transatlantic slave trade, cotton picking, sugar plantations, slave ships. You might also think that that horrific moment in humanity has been confined to the history books with the abolishment of slavery nearly 200 years ago. Yet today's modern slavery is not confined to the history books, nor is it happening on distant shores. It is in the cities and the towns that we live in. It is the largest growing international crime. Slavery is worth $150 billion a year. That's more than the profits of Apple, Google, Microsoft, Starbucks. Today, there are more people on any one day caught in the ties of slavery compared to the whole of the transatlantic slave trade, which enslaved 10 to 12 million Africans. The transatlantic slave trade left behind a legacy of inequality that today's generations are still experiencing. So by understanding the struggles of those who came before us, and by recognizing the parallels between historical slavery and present day exploitation, we must learn how to effect change, even in what seems the most insurmountable odds. Modern slavery is a complex and hidden crime, with 50 million people a year trafficked, tricked, coerced, forced, or born into slavery. That's an increase of 10 million since 2016. And despite it being invisible, slavery is all around us. It's the people who serve our drinks, clean our vehicles, clean our homes, pick our crops, make our food, maybe care for our children and elderly. We have a duty of care to protect the most vulnerable from such exploitations. It's estimated there are approximately 122,000 people caught in modern slavery just in the UK, and that's from a population of approximately 65 million. So that's 1.8 people for every 1,000 people. And it's estimated to cost the UK £33 billion a year. Aside from the hidden slavery in our own country, we are also contributing to slavery within the supply chain. So consider the layers of actors involved in the supply chain: materials, processes, labour. In the supply chain, the flow of goods and services from businesses and locations, there are lots of opportunities for modern slavery violations to occur. So we're going to learn more about the context of modern slavery and how through our own actions and sometimes inactions, we are contributing towards its growth. And finally, we're going to understand how practitioners can lean into the dialogue of modern slavery. So let's start at the beginning, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG. These are a series of 17 goals fixed by the United Nations and adopted by 193 countries in 2015. You might recognise the logos that you see on the screen. And it is through sustainable, and what I mean by that is economic, environment and social development, that the overall objectives of SDG is to actually create a better world and a better life for all by 2030. So within the 17 goals, there are 169 targets and 231 unique indicators, and that's helping us to establish the progress of SDG. I would recommend, if you're not familiar with it, do have a look at the UN SDG website for further details. We're not going to delve too much into SDG in this section. We're mainly going to focus on Goal 8, which is all about decent work. But before we do need to understand the context of some of these goals and how they actually impact on modern slavery. Often when you hear people talk about sustainability, we link it to the environment, but there are much broader global issues that also we need to tackle under SDG. So SDG is about protecting people and planet. Now, our population is going to grow from 7 billion to about 8.5 billion by 2030. And that's putting a huge amount of pressure on our resources, and it's exacerbating some of the global issues that we face today. And that has a direct link to modern slavery. So to understand modern slavery and the causes, we also need to understand some of the global problems that we need to tackle at source. So I've put some key facts on the screen for you. They are huge problems that need to be tackled, and this slide is not even touching the tip of the iceberg. The recent pandemic pushed a further 71 million people into extreme poverty. Since the war in Ukraine, the global food supply has been disrupted. Ukraine was one of the major exporters of cereal grain and sunflower oil, and that war has increased hunger risk for 1/5 of the global population, around 1.7 billion people. We're also seeing rising food prices, climbing energy prices, and growing financial constraints. If we talk a little bit about the environment, just last year, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, and most recently Libya have all suffered extensive flooding. Europe experienced Storm Daniel, the largest Mediterranean tropical-like cyclone ever recorded. And in the US, they have set a record for the most national disasters in a single year, 23 extreme weather events, and it's cost them $57.6 billion. In the UK, we are constantly being hit by extreme temperature levels year on year. We've seen Lincolnshire hit 40.3 degrees Celsius 1 July 2 years ago. And most recently, we're experiencing a lot of mildest weather on record. And you would have seen in the news very recently about how the world, the globe, has had some of its warmest temperatures this year. So extreme weather is not just becoming more extreme, it's also becoming more frequent. And we're breaking records every year. And more worryingly, the acceleration of such events are becoming more frequent and severe. So it is with rapid pace this is happening. Humanity is in a code red warning. So for us to understand modern slavery, we also need to understand the sources. So SDG is about protecting people and planet. So if we look at parts of the world, modern slavery has been driven by ongoing political instability, civil insecurity, economic downturn, factors such as climate change, extreme weather, migration, food scarcities, increased poverty. They're all creating very vulnerable environments for people. Despite the richest 1% of the world's population creating twice as much emissions as the poorest 50%, it is the poorest populations that bear the impact of climate change. In 2022, 3.6 million people were displaced due to climate-related disasters. Now, there is a lack of data for us to understand the impact and also to distinguish between general migration and those that have been displaced. And we need that data because we need to be able to understand and identify the correlations between modern slavery, environment, and climate. And if we don't understand that, it can delay policy, it can delay action, it can even reverse progress in some cases. So despite focusing on Goal 8 today, you can see how the remaining 16 goals also contribute towards the source that leads to creating these very vulnerable environments for people. So let's look at modern slavery in a bit more detail. Now, what you're seeing here is the triangular trade route from the 16th and 19th century. And the UK has long been a leading voice on anti-slavery. And this follows a tireless campaign led by William Wilberforce. And in 1807, the slave trade in the British Empire was abolished. And the Act for the Abolition of Slave Trade was signed into law after 18 years of trying to pass an abolition bill. The Act created fines for ship captains who continued with the trade, and those fines could be up to £100 per enslaved person found on a ship. And captains would sometimes just dump their captives overboard when they saw Navy ships coming in order to avoid these fines. Slavery in the colonies, excluding those ruled by the East India Company, were not free until 1838. So in 1807, the bill was passed, but not until 1838 did we see slaves free. And that was only after the slave owners, not the slaves themselves, received compensation. And that compensation is the equivalent of £1.6 billion in today's money. Actually, it caused such a big debt that the British taxpayer is only finally finished paying off in 2015. However, Africans who were free were not free to do as they wished, and they would be enlisted in the army or the navy. Women and children were to become apprentices to the land, and they work as labourers, domestics. So despite the change in law, Parliament was actually slow to make slave abolition effective. And that's probably because the slave trade was significant for the British Empire and our economy. 200 years ago, the cost of a slave would be the equivalent of $40,000 today, in today's money. An entire family can be now enslaved for generations for a debt as small as $18. So it's become much easier to enslave another human being, and that price is plummeting over the last 50 years. Children are being sold for as little as $5. So just think about that £20 in your pocket, fairly disposable, cheap meal, cinema. But we really need to think about how you spend that £20, which could enslave a family for generations. And you can see these are modern slave routes now. You can see how much they've changed, human trafficking routes, and certainly changed since the 19th century. So it's now mainly from the Asia regions, and its promises of jobs and money. People can be very easily tricked into being trafficked. And many people are also trafficked into the UK from overseas, and we've recently seen that with Sir Mo Farah, for example. But vulnerable British people are also being targeted, especially children from disadvantaged background. So in the UK, as a country with relatively high levels of wealth and with dedicated resources to addressing modern slavery, the UK have been at the forefront of the international efforts and have shown the strongest government response globally. In 2015, the UK became the first country to pass legislation to combat modern slavery, closely followed by Australia, Canada, and many European countries. This landmark Modern Slavery Act, a global leading piece of legislation, criminalised offences of slavery and trafficking for all forms of exploitation. And in September 2018, the UK, along with the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, established a joint framework of principles by which these 5 countries can work together to tackle modern slavery in the global supply chain. However, slavery has worsened since the introduction of legislation. And in recent years, and particularly post-Brexit, changes to the UK immigration policy has threatened to discriminate against and criminalise vulnerable people. It's increased the potential for modern slavery. There's more growing inequality, there's more poverty, there's a lack of basic needs, which is driving this vulnerability. At the Queen's speech in 2022, and following the recommendations of the Independent Review of the Modern Slavery Act, the government announced a Modern Slavery Bill, which would strengthen the content of the modern slavery and human trafficking statements, and it would create a mechanism for a public register. The statement and the purpose of the bill was to strengthen the protections and support for victims and to increase companies' accountability in terms of supply chain. However, this anticipated bill and so needed bill was noticeably absent from the King's speech in November 23. The UK has led the world in tackling this horrendous international crime and now has left a deathly silence. And it's sending a signal to the world that modern slavery is secondary to other local and national agendas. As the countries around the world are deregulating protection and equality for workers to support their economy and trading, the richest countries must lead by example. If we are to have any chance of eradicating modern slavery, we need to, in the UK, strengthen our anti-slavery framework, not weaken them. And as a global community, we must work together in tackling modern slavery. And it's a key critical issue to the supply chain. In recent years, we talked about post-Brexit and the increase of vulnerability around modern slavery. Refugees and those seeking asylum are also at heightened risk of exploitation in the UK. And this is due to social and cultural isolation, lack of access to basic resources and employment opportunities. It can also be compounded by their insecure immigration status as well. If we look at the cost of living crisis in the UK, it has made people more vulnerable to exploitation. In the year 2022, 2.1 million people, and that's about 3% of families, used a food bank. Now, we know that this has increased quite significantly, even since 22, and some food banks are struggling to cope with the increased demands. Forced labour is being reported in many sectors: farming, hospitality, beauty, construction, manufacturing, car washes, domestic services, a lot of sort of service industries. And it's all where there's a reliance on labour-intensive tasks or manual tasks and a high demand for low-cost products or cheap labour. There's also where you see a high reliance on temporary or irregular labour as well. And again, these are creating very vulnerable environments. As reported by the Centre for Social Justice, the figures show that there's been a 5 times increase of modern slavery victims in the UK since 2015. And a further distressing fact of that very high record number is that 1 in 5 are children. So it's important for us to take reasonable steps to ensure we do not employ someone who is being exploited. The government guidance, as shown on the screen, provides a lot of advice to recruiting managers on background checks and questions to ask. You can download it free from the government website. There's quite a lot of additional resources, and we'll talk a little bit about this in this session as well. So what about the supply chain? Well, it's estimated 80% of global trade passes through our supply chain. UK is no different. The UK imports around about $26.1 billion of products annually, and they potentially are at risk of being made using forced labour. Nearly 2/3 of all forced labour cases are linked to global supply chains. Most forced labour occurs in the lowest tier of the supply chain, so the extraction of raw materials to manufacturing and shipping. The reality of this is that children are being forced to mine cobalt for use in the latest mobile phones, or women forced to produce coffee for one of the best known coffee brands. And we've seen some very recent cases coming up still talking about this with very well known brands. If you consider a single smartphone or a laptop, and you think of the thousands of components, and all of those components each have their own supply chain and material extraction. Therefore, implementing effective supply chain management and also that comprehensive monitoring to eliminate slavery in the life cycle of a product, we can only achieve it by working collaboratively. Now, the health and safety community can take an active role in eradicating modern slavery. We are able to use our existing risk management skills, influencing and educating. We are practitioners that have critical skills in advocating change, working with employers. We could be part of that solution for checking supply chains, ensuring they have decent, safe, and healthy working conditions. There are companies that support the transparency of supply chains. So you take a look at the Know the Chain, where you can actually search for companies on their performance and benchmark against standards. So I've summarised some actions for you here. And this is about highlight your commitment by publishing a slavery and human trafficking statement to demonstrate your steps as a business to prevent modern slavery. Your statement should be active, though, not just a compliance statement. It doesn't want to sit on a website hidden with your T's and C's and your GDPR statements. It needs to be active. You should have existing policies and processes that feed from that as well. So reviews to address and eliminate modern slavery, such as recruitment processes, where you make key business decisions, the guidelines around that, maybe investments that you've made as a business, and you may not inadvertently know that you're contributing towards modern slavery. And it's also important to engage with suppliers, key bit, inform them of your commitment about preventing modern slavery and support them on mitigating their own risks. Introduce a supplier's code of conduct that clearly outlines your standards and expectations for ethical practices. In particular, how you expect your suppliers to operate to avoid labour exploitation, and include clauses on modern slavery in their contracts. You may also want to conduct an assessment to identify potential high risks in your supply chain, such as low or unskilled labour, or countries or industries where it's known to have high levels of modern slavery. Monitor and audit your supply chain to understand not just your own practices, but how you manage other supply chains and how they manage and how materials are sourced. Use incentives and collaboration can actually influence change, but also clearly outline actions for those unable to operate ethically. And finally, advocate and lead change. Practitioners are very good at doing this, and education is an important part of that journey to reduce the risk within your companies. There are many different types and forms of modern slavery, and there's much misconception around it. But if you're training your staff on modern slavery, You're demonstrating your commitment as an organisation and what steps you're going to be taking to reduce that risk. You're getting support from individual commitment. You're reinforcing the organisation's clear message. If you can train staff in procurement and other areas of how to spot and report signs of modern slavery throughout the supply chain and also within your own organisation, but also support your leadership team on how to drive profit with integrity. Provide tools and messages to incentify and enable the leadership team to act on risk. I'll put some questions on here that you may wish to ask of your leadership team or your board. And you can see that what we're asking is not just about, do you have a policy, but is it effective? Is it widely communicated? Is there a big commitment to it? Is it available for people to be able to see? Looking at your risk assessments and effective auditing as well. What metrics do you use? What KPIs are you using? What contractual obligations are the financial penalties? What about transparency of data? What about suppliers' code of conduct? Has the board received information? Is it sufficiently covered on the board agenda? Where does it sit on the board agenda? Is it at the beginning, the end? Not at all. And think about establishing management accountability. Allocate lead roles and responsibilities at operational and senior management level, and equip your employees for those roles as well. And of course, effective staff training and education. And these questions are really good starting points of asking your company or board about how effective you are managing modern slavery. Sometimes we can be aware of these global issues, but as individuals, we may not necessarily know that some of our actions, we are contributing to these appalling conditions. As an example, fast fashion. And it doesn't even have to be cheap fast fashion. It can be really expensive, well-branded labels, or electronics from known brands that have a reputation for forced labour. Consider our consumer needs. Consider us as consumers. As we click a button on an e-commerce site for that next day delivery, that reality of modern slavery can seem very distant concern. So despite the fact that we're having a conversation regarding organisations' duty of care, as individuals, we can make a decision and we can actually affect that difference by our own considered actions. So I always think about the butterfly effect in the chaos theory here. Butterfly flaps its wings and it creates a hurricane across the other side of the world. These small changes that we can all make can amount to more dramatic global progress. So from thinking about some of these questions that I've been asking, as a consumer, think about those products around you. Where did you get your paper from? Where did they get their material from? Who processed it? Who cut the tree down? There are some very big brand chocolate companies that are still sourcing their cocoa from West Africa. There's lots of cases of child labour there and forced labour that's been discovered, and it still persists. There's a shocking figure that perhaps 1 in 3 foreign workers in Malaysia electronic sector will be working under conditions of forced labour. There's some sort of key products that sometimes connect a variety of products with modern slavery. So when I think about crisps and ice cream and lipstick, and it's all connected through palm oil. There's so many of our products that are connected through palm oil. So the palm oil employs around about 3.5 million people. So apart from the deforestation and the environmental problems that come from palm oil, it also creates modern slavery concerns. So if you have done the QR questions, Christina asked you a lot of questions yourself about how much of a conscious consumer are you? Do you consider it? And now you can see there's a link on here to the slavery footprint. So you can actually calculate your lifestyle and impact on modern slavery. Another question I asked is how much should you prepare to pay for a product if it's guaranteed to be slavery free? So it costs consumers a little 1.8% more per item to double the pay of a sweatshop worker. And even though there's been various sort of questions asked around very similar, and by research companies have looked at consumers and how much they're prepared to pay. And actually, a lot of consumers would be willing to pay up to 15% if it was guaranteed for slavery-free clothing. And of course, there are other questions concerning whether you think modern slavery might be in the products and services you buy, and we'll come to that in a second. So as I've mentioned, there are plenty of free resources for you to access, and I've listed some of them on the QR code questionnaire as well. So another resource for you is the Freedom Map, and you can find this on the Freedom United website, and it shows much more detail about key products that link to slavery and regions around the world. So what this is doing is it's showing you that there are certain products in certain parts of the world that are known and have higher prevalence of modern slavery. So Asia and the Pacific regions have the highest number of people in forced labour, about 15.1 million, and the Arab states have the highest prevalence. So that's 5.3 per 1,000 people. Now, I asked in that QR code, do you think that modern slavery is within your supply chain? Well, a survey in 2016 by the ILO concluded that 77% of UK brands privately believe modern slavery is present in the supply chain. So you can see why we need to have more than just dialogue and policies. We do need some affirmative action. So while the principal changes of responsibility lie with national governments, a whole society approach is required. We all need to come together, businesses, investors, survivor groups, NGOs, civil society, individuals. We all, an array of us, have an actor's role to play, a critical role to play here. Modern slavery increases year on year, and with rising inflation, supply chain disruptions, lots of geopolitical turmoil. We know that this year is going to be really heightened around the world for lots of election campaigns globally. There's lots of labour market challenges. So all of these risks are dramatically increasing the pace around modern slavery. When we talk about some of these subjects, end extreme poverty, fight inequality and injustice, fix climate change, end modern slavery, these are big goals. So how can we all make a difference? And as governments and international organisations and world leaders discuss and set world-changing objectives, can we as individuals make a positive impact? Now, every human on Earth is part of that solution. Unfortunately, there are some super easy things that we can adopt into our everyday routine. But if we all do it, it will make a difference. So I've put a couple of thoughts on the slide around self and beyond self and organisation, but educate yourself, know the signs, be conscious as a consumer and buy from ethical and slave-free companies. Spread the word to friends and family. Support, volunteer, donate to charities working to stop modern slavery. Advocate changes at your workplace. We are all horrified by the cruelty that is inflicted from one human to another during the transatlantic slave trade. Yet today, more than 200 years after slavery was abolished, despite overwhelming evidence and testimonies, modern slavery is thriving. We can no longer be a passive voice to a modern-day human tragedy. When I talk about modern slavery, I often think, would I have been on the right side of history during the 16th to 19th century? Would I have been an advocate to change slavery laws, or would I have chosen to look the other way? And we are faced with that same choice today. Do we take action, whether it's an organisation or an individual, or do we choose to avert our gaze? Will you be on the right side of history in another 200 years? We cannot unseen the scene. We are now in the decade of action, the last 6 years of the 2030 goals. It's time for action. 2024 is time for us to stand up and make a change. We all have the ability to make a difference. So please, use this moment to create a legacy of change. Thank you.